The day Karen decided to sue me didn't feel dramatic at first. It started like any other
I
normal
told you to
morning
fix
in a
this right
quiet
now.
HOA
Don't just
neighborhood.
stand there,
The
do
kind where
something.
everything looks peaceful but tension lives just under the surface. I was in my driveway washing my car, something I had done dozens of times before. The sun was out, birds were chirping, and I was just trying to enjoy my weekend. Then I noticed her, standing across the street, watching, arms folded tight, lips pressed together, sunglasses hiding her eyes but not the attitude. Even before she walked over, I could feel trouble coming. Karen was already known in the neighborhood. Everyone had stories about her. She used to be on the HOA board years ago. But even after stepping down, she never stopped acting like she was in charge. She walked around with a phone in her hand, taking pictures of things she didn't like. Trash cans, lawns, cars, decorations. People avoided her when they saw her coming. I usually ignored her. But that day she made sure I couldn't tea. She marched right up to me and told me I was violating HOA rules by washing my car in my own driveway. Not asked, told. Her voice had that condescending tone, like she was speaking to a child. I asked her calmly which rule I was breaking. She couldn't name one. She just kept repeating that it was against HOA regulations, and that she knew the rules better than I did. I told her I'd check the HOA handbook and went back to what I was doing, hoping she'd leave. She didn't look happy. A few hours later, I got an email from the HOA management company. It said a complaint had been filed against my property for unauthorized vehicle maintenance. Reading that phrase made me laugh at first. Then the anger kicked in. Unauthorized maintenance. I wasn't changing oil or rebuilding an engine. I was rinsing soap off my car. Still, I stayed professional. I replied politely and asked for the exact rule number I had violated. No response came. 2 days later, a certified letter showed up in my mailbox. Inside was an official notice of violation, a fine, and a warning about further enforcement if the issue wasn't corrected. That's when it hit me. Karen had escalated this on purpose. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was targeted. I sat down that evening and read through the HOA bylaws word by word. There was nothing, no clause, no footnote, no hidden language that banned washing a car. I highlighted sections, took screenshots, and saved everything. I emailed the HOA again, attaching proof and calmly explaining that no such rule existed. This time, the reply didn't come from the management company. It came from Karen. She had somehow inserted herself into the process even though she wasn't officially responsible for enforcement. Her message was cold and smug. She claimed the HOA had discretionary authority and warned that
I
continued
told you to
resistance
fix this
could lead
right
to
now.
legal consequences.
Don't just stand there,
That was
do
the first time
something.
the threat became real. So, over a car wash. Over the next week, the pressure increased. Another letter arrived accusing me of repeated violations. Fines increased. The language became aggressive, talking about protecting community standards and property values. Karen started telling neighbors that I was defiant and refusing to follow HOA rules. People began looking at me differently, even though some quietly admitted they thought the situation was ridiculous. I felt frustrated and angry. But more than that, I felt harassed. Then came the envelope that changed everything. A court notice. Official. Legal. My name listed as the defendant. Karen, acting through the HOA, had filed a lawsuit against me. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the papers, rereading the words again and again. I had never been sued before. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking. All of this, because I washed my car. That night, sleep was impossible. My mind replayed every interaction, every email, every look she gave me across the street. It became clear this had never been about rules. It was about control. Karen couldn't stand being ignored. She couldn't stand someone questioning her authority. So she pushed until the situation exploded into a lawsuit. Convinced I'd back down the moment things got serious. But instead of giving in, something else happened. I got angry in a different way. A focused way. I realized that if I didn't stand up now, she'd keep doing this to others. I gathered every piece of evidence I had. Emails, letters, Photos of other neighbors washing their cars with no consequences. The
I
HOA
told you to
handbook with
fix this
highlighted
right
sections.
now.
I
Don't just
contacted a
stand there,
legal
do
advisor
something.
and explained everything. For the first time since this started, I felt a sense of control returning. Holding that court notice in my hands, I understood that this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was proof of how easily HOA power could be abused when someone like Karen decided to go too far. She thought a lawsuit would scare me into silence. What she didn't realize was that she had just pushed me to fight back, and the real drama was only beginning. After the initial shock of learning that Karen had officially filed a complaint against me, the next few days felt like living in a constant state of tension. The fake violations she conjured up seemed to multiply with every passing hour, each one more absurd than the last. I started receiving emails and letters from the HOA, all worded in the most intimidating, legal-sounding tone imaginable. Each notice claimed that I was in violation of community standards, or repeatedly failing to comply with HOA regulations, without ever citing an actual rule I had broken. It became obvious that Karen was using every tool at her disposal to make my life miserable, testing just how far she could push the limits of HOA power. The first letter was almost comical if it weren't so serious. It accused me of doing unauthorized vehicle maintenance in my driveway. I could still picture myself scrubbing the car, soap suds running down the driveway, while reading the words and thinking, unauthorized maintenance. Really? That's when I realized Karen was treating every small personal choice as a weapon. It didn't matter that I had lived in the neighborhood for years, that I followed the rules, or that no one else had ever been fined for washing their car. Karen had decided that I would be the target, and she wouldn't stop until she got her way. Soon, more letters arrived, each one escalating in tone and threat. One of them stated that failure to comply with community regulations may result in further enforcement actions, including fines, liens, or legal proceedings. The use of official-looking letterhead and legal jargon made it seem frightening, especially for someone who had never dealt with an HOA lawsuit before. But what really stood out was the audacity of it. Karen had no actual authority to enforce these rules personally, yet she managed to make the HOA act as if she did. The letters were written in a way that made it look like the entire board was aligned against me, even though most neighbors had no idea what was happening. I started keeping a folder for all the communications, documenting every email, letter, and phone call. The pattern became clear. Karen was abusing her past status on the HOA board to manipulate the system. She would complain to the HOA management company, claim some vague violation, and then wait to see how the letters frightened me. Each time, she pushed just a little further, testing how much leverage she could create. It was like watching a chess game unfold where I was both the pawn and the target. One particularly ridiculous letter accused me of violating landscaping rules, claiming my flower beds were inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. I looked out at my yard, carefully maintained and neat, and couldn't believe what I was reading. The letter included multiple threats about fines and legal action if I didn't correct the issue immediately. It was clear Karen had no real complaints. This was harassment disguised as enforcement. She was wielding the HOA like a weapon, using fake violations to intimidate me into submission. The psychological toll was significant. Every time I checked the mailbox, I felt a sinking sense of dread. I had to be careful about everything: the angle at which my trash cans were placed, the types of decorations in my yard, even how I parked my car. It felt like living in a neighborhood prison, constantly monitored by someone with an overinflated sense of authority. Yet, at the same time, I realized this was a test of boundaries. Karen was trying to see if she could bend the HOA system to her personal vendetta. Emails from the HOA management were equally frustrating. They would forward her complaints but rarely provide details or rule citations.
I
When
told you
asked
to
for
fix this right
clarification,
now.
the responses
Don't just
were vague,
stand there, do
often
something.
repeating legal phrases without substance. It became apparent that the HOA was being manipulated, willingly or unknowingly, by Karen's persistence and intimidation. The combination of fake violations, threatening letters, and vague legal language created a pressure cooker environment. Karen was creating fear not through actual law or rule breaking, but through manipulation of perception. Neighbors started noticing the tension as well. Some asked me what was happening, curious but cautious, because they had seen Karen's aggressive behavior before. I explained the situation, showing them the letters and emails. Most were shocked that one person could wield such influence over an entire neighborhood's governing body. It was a clear example of HOA power abuse. Someone using their past or perceived authority to create stress and conflict for personal satisfaction. Despite the mounting pressure, I decided to respond strategically. I documented every interaction, kept detailed notes, and gathered evidence that contradicted every fake violation Karen had raised. Photos of my yard and driveway, screenshots of HOA rules, and proof that other residents were not fined for similar behavior became my arsenal. What began as a minor annoyance washing my car was evolving into a legal standoff where evidence and documentation were my only defenses against bullying. Throughout it all, the harassment never let up. Every letter and email reminded me that Karen's goal wasn't compliance but control. She wanted to assert dominance, and the HOA system gave her the perfect tool. It wasn't about the rules. It wasn't about neighborhood standards. It was about making me feel powerless, hoping that I would either pay fines, apologize, or leave the neighborhood entirely. The realization was infuriating but also clarifying. Karen's abuse of HOA power was personal, calculated, and relentless. By the end of that week, I was mentally preparing for what seemed inevitable. A court case. The letters, fines, and threats had escalated to a point where ignoring them was no longer an option. It was clear that Karen's combination of fake violations and intimidation tactics was designed to push me to a breaking point. But instead of backing down, I decided that each letter would strengthen my resolve. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more I documented, collected evidence, and prepared for the day when the truth would come out in court. This period of fake violations and threats taught me an important lesson about HOA power. It can be abused in subtle and insidious ways. The rules themselves may be written clearly, but when someone manipulates the system, even minor infractions or completely invented ones can feel overwhelming. Karen was a master at this, and the letters, fines, and court threats were all part of her strategy. But by staying organized, documenting every detail, and keeping a clear perspective, I realized that I could not only defend myself but also expose the abuse of authority for what it truly was. The day the court summons arrived, I remember feeling a strange mix of disbelief, anger, and a twinge of fear. It was one of those crisp mornings where the sun is shining but a chill lingers in the air, and the mailbox held the envelope that would change everything. I picked it up with caution, noting the official stamp and the words, "Summons and Complaint," printed in bold. My heart skipped a beat as I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the papers. There it was in black and white. Karen, representing herself or at least using the HOA as her proxy, was suing me. My own name listed as the defendant. My neighborhood, which I had always considered peaceful and predictable, suddenly felt like a battlefield. I sat down at the kitchen table, the envelope trembling slightly in my hands, and read through the document multiple times. The lawsuit claimed that I had repeatedly violated HOA rules, damaged community aesthetics, and disrespected the authority of the board. It was carefully worded to sound serious and credible, but anyone reading closely would notice the vagueness and lack of specific rule citations. Karen had turned minor personal preferences and imagined infractions into a legal case. I couldn't help but feel a surge of disbelief. Was this really happening? Over something as trivial as washing a car. Yet here it was. Official, real, and terrifyingly absurd. The first thing I noticed about Karen's approach was her confidence. She clearly believed she was untouchable, that the courts would side with her without question. From the moment she began circulating rumors among neighbors about my defiance and rule breaking, she had acted like she already owned the narrative. Her emails had a smugness that hinted at overconfidence, and the way she prepared her complaint reflected her belief that she had carefully built an unassailable case. She referenced past HOA board meetings, minor neighborhood disagreements, and anecdotal observations, framing them as evidence of a
Saints.
pattern of
I
misconduct.
told you to fix
It was
this
clear
right
that she
now.
expected me
Don't
to be
just stand there,
intimidated,
do
to
something.
fold under pressure, and to pay fines or apologize just to make her go away. That overconfidence was almost palpable, radiating from the pages of the court summons as if she were sitting across from me. Smirking, once the initial shock faded, I began analyzing the complaint with a more critical eye. Karen's legal argument relied heavily on interpretations that stretched or outright ignored the actual HOA bylaws. She cited vague clauses about community standards and maintenance of property values, but none of these clauses were enforceable in the way she claimed. The entire case was built on assumptions, intimidation, and her perception of authority rather than law. Still, the fact that it had reached this stage meant I couldn't ignore it. I needed to be prepared. And the first step was understanding exactly what she had done and how she intended to use it against me. Neighbors started whispering after the summons arrived, some expressing sympathy, others quietly questioning my actions. Karen, on the other hand, seemed energized by the attention. She strutted through the neighborhood as though announcing to anyone who would listen that she had taken action and would soon emerge victorious. I heard reports that she was telling friends and acquaintances that the case was a no-brainer, that the HOA rules were clear, and that I was in the wrong. It was infuriating because everyone else who read the actual bylaws knew this was far from clear. But that was the brilliance or the danger of her strategy. Perception mattered more than reality. She wanted to create the illusion of legitimacy and power, and many people fell for it. The summons also forced me to confront my own emotions. Anger, fear, and frustration mixed together, making it difficult to focus at first. But once I took a step back, I realized that Karen's confidence was also her weakness. She had overestimated her understanding of the law and underestimated my willingness to fight. While she had crafted a narrative filled with intimidation and assumptions, I had actual facts, documentation, and evidence to support my side. Photos of my property, copies of emails, HOA bylaws, and proof of how other residents were treated fairly could all dismantle her claims. Her confidence, rooted in her belief that she could bully me, blinded her to the possibility that I could stand my ground effectively. I started organizing everything meticulously. Each letter, email, and complaint was categorized and time-stamped. I created a folder for photos showing that my property was well maintained, evidence that I followed HOA rules, and screenshots of correspondence that highlighted inconsistencies in her claims. Even the witness statements from other neighbors who had seen her harassment became part of the record. Preparing for court felt like building an arsenal. Every piece of evidence became a tool to counter her overconfidence and fabricated claims. The goal was clear: expose the manipulation and prove that her threats had no legal basis. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign outside the legal documents. She was relentless in spreading her narrative, subtly influencing neighbors and attempting to isolate me socially. It was clear she believed that if she could create enough fear or doubt, I might settle or back down without the case even going to court. But by documenting her actions, I turned her confidence against her. Each threat, letter, and fabricated violation became evidence of harassment rather than a legitimate legal claim. Her overconfidence would soon become her undoing. As the court date approached, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Karen walked around as if she were already the victor, while I focused on preparation, clarity, and calm. The contrast could not have been more stark. Her confidence was built on intimidation and manipulation, mine on facts, documentation, and a refusal to be bullied. It was becoming clear that the lawsuit was not just a legal matter but a test of willpower, persistence, and attention to detail. By the time I received the final notice confirming the court date, I had shifted from fear to resolve. Karen may have believed she would win because she had the audacity to file and the confidence to strut through the neighborhood proclaiming victory. But her real mistake was thinking that confidence alone could outweigh truth, evidence, and preparation. The summons that once made my heart sink now fueled a determination to prove that HOA power abuse and personal vendettas could not dictate the outcome of a fair court case. The day of the court hearing arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nerves that I had never experienced before. Walking into the courtroom, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The air was a mix of seriousness and tension, the polished wood of the benches gleaming under fluorescent lights, and the quiet murmurs of other cases happening in the background adding to the surreal feeling. Karen, on the other hand, appeared almost jubilant. She walked in with her head held high, papers in hand, projecting confidence as though the victory was already hers. She had convinced herself and apparently anyone who would listen that she had built an airtight case. But I knew differently, and the evidence I had gathered gave me a sense of quiet confidence that steadied my nerves. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. This was no longer just a neighborhood squabble or a series of threatening letters. It was now a formal legal proceeding. The clerk called the case, and Karen immediately took the floor to present her argument. Her voice was firm, almost rehearsed, as she laid out the claims against me. She referenced alleged HOA violations, property aesthetics, and repeated noncompliance, painting a picture of me as a negligent and defiant neighbor. She spoke with a level of certainty that suggested she believed her narrative would go unchallenged. And she looked around the room with a smug expression, as if daring anyone to question her. When it was my turn to respond, I remained calm, presenting the documentation I had meticulously organized over the past weeks. I walked the judge through the evidence step by step. Photos of my property showing that everything was well maintained. Copies of HOA rules highlighting that there were no prohibitions on washing a car in a driveway. Email threads showing my polite requests for clarification. And even statements from neighbors who had witnessed the harassment. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the facade Karen had built. While she had relied on intimidation and vague allegations, I relied on facts, records, and a clear demonstration of fairness and compliance. Karen attempted to interject at several points, trying to argue that her perception of community standards should be enough to validate her claims. The judge, however, maintained control and reminded her that HOA rules must be specific and enforceable, not based on subjective opinions. This seemed to rattle her slightly. Her overconfidence, which had carried her through the neighborhood gossip and letter-writing phase, did not translate well into the courtroom, where facts and law mattered more than perception or intimidation. As the proceedings continued, it became apparent that Karen had underestimated the seriousness of presenting her case in front of a judge. Her arguments were circular, relying on emotional appeals and her own sense of authority rather than any legal foundation. She cited community values and aesthetic standards repeatedly, but when pressed, she could not point to any enforceable rule or bylaw that I had violated. Every time she made a statement, I calmly countered with evidence, demonstrating that her claims were based on personal interpretation and not on any actionable regulation. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense but also almost surreal. I could sense a few spectators exchanging glances, likely noticing the disparity between Karen's aggressive stance and the factual solidity of my defense. It was fascinating to watch how her body language changed as the hearing progressed. The earlier swagger, the confidence that radiated in neighborhood confrontations, slowly gave way to frustration and visible tension. I remained composed, taking deep breaths and focusing on presenting my case clearly and concisely. Each fact I introduced chipped away at her narrative and subtly shifted the perception in the room. At one point, the judge asked Karen to clarify which HOA regulations I had violated and to provide supporting documentation. She fumbled, unable to provide concrete evidence beyond the vague letters and emails she had sent previously. The judge's questions highlighted the weakness of her case. I noticed her hands shake slightly as she shuffled papers, clearly realizing that her overconfidence had not prepared her for this level of scrutiny. She tried to recover by repeating her claims, but the judge's calm insistence on rule-based evidence left her floundering. I took the opportunity to summarize my position, emphasizing that I had consistently acted within the rules, that the HOA had no enforceable regulation prohibiting my actions, and that Karen had abused her perceived authority to create false violations. I stressed the importance of factual evidence over intimidation, making it clear that the legal system was not a tool for personal vendettas. The judge listened attentively, occasionally nodding, and took notes, which reinforced my belief that the truth would carry the day. What struck me most during the hearing was the contrast between Karen's theatrical confidence and my steady presentation. She had counted on a courtroom stage to mirror the fear and submission she had cultivated through letters and neighborhood gossip. But the structure of the legal process exposed the fragility of her claims. Confidence alone, it turned out, was not enough when confronted with documented evidence. Careful preparation and adherence to the law. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge asked both parties to submit any remaining documentation and promised to review all evidence before issuing a decision. Karen left the courtroom with the same determined stride she had entered with. Though there was a subtle tension in her expression, I left with a sense of cautious optimism, knowing that the facts were firmly on my side. The experience was exhausting but empowering. I had stood my ground in front of a judge, countered false claims with evidence, and faced the intimidation tactics head-on. Walking out of the courthouse, the sunlight felt brighter than ever. Karen's overconfidence had been tested, and while the final decision was still pending, I had learned an important lesson. Preparation, evidence, and composure could outmatch bluster and intimidation in any setting. The courtroom had stripped away the theatrics, leaving only truth, facts, in the law. Karen's attempt to dominate through perceived power and fabricated violations had been challenged in a space where reality mattered. And I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that justice had a real chance to prevail. The day the judge issued the final decision was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. And it started early in the morning with a strange mix of anticipation and relief. I arrived at the courthouse a little before it opened, the crisp air biting at my cheeks, and found a quiet corner to wait. The hallway buzzed with the usual morning activity: lawyers, plaintiffs, defendants, court clerks, but my focus was entirely on the envelope that would contain the judge's ruling. After weeks of stress, endless letters, and sleepless nights, this was the moment when all the preparation, documentation, and patience would finally pay off. When my name was called, I walked into the courtroom and saw Karen sitting there, exuding the same overconfidence she had carried from the very beginning. Her head was high, her posture rigid, and her expression smug, as if she already knew the decision would favor her. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of amusement at the contrast between her confidence and the reality that was about to unfold. For weeks, she had acted like a neighborhood queen, using her perceived authority to intimidate me and manipulate the HOA system. But now, in front of a judge, all that bravado was about to meet the undeniable power of documented truth and the law. The judge began by summarizing the case, outlining the claims made by Karen and the HOA, and reviewing the evidence presented. It was clear from the start that the judge had taken the time to thoroughly examine every document, email, and photograph I had submitted. The judge noted the repeated references to alleged violations and the lack of specific, enforceable rules supporting Karen's claims. It was almost poetic justice. All the threats, fake violations, and intimidating letters that had caused so much stress were now being dissected and exposed as baseless. When the judge addressed Karen's claims directly, it became evident how fragile her case really was. Each point she had made was countered by documentation and clear evidence. The supposed violations of community standards and aesthetic rules were dismissed because they were vague and subjective, lacking any legal standing. The letters she had sent, the threats, and the intimidation tactics were acknowledged as attempts to influence compliance through fear rather than legitimate rule enforcement. Every time the judge referenced a specific piece of evidence I had provided, Karen's expression shifted slightly, betraying her realization that confidence and bluster alone could not substitute for facts. The judge then focused on the heart of the matter: the abuse of HOA power and the misuse of legal threats. Karen's repeated attempts to escalate minor personal actions into official complaints were framed as harassment, and the court recognized that her actions were motivated more by personal vendetta than genuine concern for the community. The ruling emphasized that HOA authority must be exercised fairly, transparently, and within the boundaries of the bylaws. In other words, Karen had overstepped every limit, and the legal system was not going to allow intimidation to substitute for law. Hearing this read aloud felt like a vindication not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been subjected to petty harassment masked as rule enforcement. When the final judgment was read, it was nothing short of a triumph. The court dismissed all of Karen's claims in their entirety. Not only were the alleged violations deemed unfounded, but the judge also ruled that the letters and threats sent by Karen could not serve as legal leverage. Every single accusation she had made was rejected, and the ruling reinforced that the HOA could not arbitrarily impose fines or initiate legal action without clear, enforceable rules. It was a complete and total defeat for her, a formal acknowledgement that her campaign of intimidation had failed. As the decision sank in, I felt a wave of relief and empowerment. The stress, the tension, and the fear that had built over weeks suddenly lifted. Karen's overconfidence, which had carried her through the neighborhood gossip and the initial legal filings, had completely backfired. The same letters, emails, and threats she had used to intimidate me had now been exposed as baseless and irrelevant in the eyes of the law. It was as if the system itself had turned the tables on her, demonstrating that confidence without substance is meaningless when confronted with facts, evidence, and justice. After the judgment, the courtroom atmosphere was a mixture of quiet satisfaction and subdued shock. Karen sat there, stunned and speechless, unable to reconcile her perception of inevitable victory with the reality of the decision. Her posture had changed. The rigid confidence was gone, replaced with a rigid disbelief that could almost be seen in her clenched fists and tight jaw. I, on the other hand, felt a sense of calm triumph. Every piece of documentation, every photo, every email thread had contributed to this outcome. Preparation, patience, and adherence to the truth had won over intimidation, manipulation, and false confidence. Walking out of the courthouse, I noticed neighbors observing the scene, some nodding in quiet approval, others whispering about the dramatic reversal. The story of Karen's lawsuit and its failure would become part of neighborhood lore. A clear example of how overconfidence and abuse of authority can collapse when faced with evidence and fairness. For me, the experience was both a relief and a lesson. Legal systems exist to protect truth and fairness, not to allow personal vendettas or inflated egos to dictate outcomes. That evening, as I reflected on everything, I realized how transformative the experience had been. The entire ordeal, from fake violations and threatening letters to the nerve-wracking courtroom drama, had tested my patience, resilience, and determination. But it also showed that preparation, meticulous documentation, and remaining calm under pressure can turn even the most absurd harassment into a clear victory. Karen's confidence, once a tool for intimidation, had become her downfall. What she believed would be an easy win ended in a total backfire, reinforcing that real authority lies in law, facts, and fairness, not in ego or bluster. By the time I returned home, the weight of weeks of anxiety had lifted, replaced by a sense of empowerment and closure. The neighborhood was the same physically, but the dynamics had shifted. Karen's influence had been legally neutralized, and her attempt to manipulate the HOA system had been exposed for what it truly was. For anyone following the story, it was a powerful lesson. Threats, intimidation, and false confidence can only take you so far. When the truth is presented clearly and patiently, the system will recognize it. Karen's lawsuit, intended to control and intimidate, had completely backfired. Injustice, clear, methodical, and undeniable, had prevailed.